Okay. Hi, I'm Bridget, and we're going to talk a little bit about increasing reliability via Helm pre-release checks. And the TLDR on me is I live in the US. I'm very much hoping Canada will annex us soon because I'm in the middle and the north of the US, Minnesota. People basically think we're Canada, and I'm like, yes, please, especially depending on how things go politically in the US. I work for Microsoft. If I don't look familiar, but I sound familiar, you may have heard me on the podcast Arrested DevOps. And I also help lead the DevOps Days organization worldwide. So I know you have a great DevOps Days here in Amsterdam. And if you're looking at me and thinking, wait a minute, if you're thinking, where in the world is Lockie? Like, shouldn't he be here giving this talk? And also, we thought the talk was going to be slightly different, but it was definitely not going to be whoever this is. The problem is, teleportation has not been invented yet, as far as I know. If you have a teleportation startup, please let me know. I would like to invest in it, because turns out airplanes are terrible and take way too long. And so Lockie was actually on stage at HashiConf, giving a keynote yesterday, and that would be very difficult for him to also be here. So, but he did write most of this talk, which means I will definitely be looking at notes slightly more than I usually do. And yeah, I hope that this will still give you some of the content you were looking for. The other thing that's slightly different than what the talk was originally pitched as is it was going to be all about the failure detection that would have been feasible if Lua had been something that landed in Helm v3. And the whole community was like, we would like our Helm v3 sooner and not forever into the future. And so, yeah, fortunately, there are exciting open source tools in this ecosystem that will still help with the pre-release failure checks. And if you're thinking like, okay, what exactly are you talking about? I think it can pretty much be summed up by there are, yes, this is the Vasa. If you are either Swedish or Danish, you may have opinions about this from one way or the other. I highly recommend everyone go to the Vasa Museum in Stockholm. It's delightful. And I think that the takeaway here is that no matter how much you plan, if there's scope creep and lack of documentation, things might not turn out okay. And I think that it's going to be, the bad news is it's going to be harder and harder to have successful Helm releases just because Kubernetes is really complex and is not getting simpler. And so that's why these pre-release checks, I think, are going to be really valuable. All right. And so we're going to talk about a few. Here's the agenda. And if you're like, oh, I'm already an expert in all those tools, then you should definitely go to a different session at this moment, and I will not be offended. But and if you're on that side, you can actually sneak down the hallway and into the other session for whatever reason. I'm not sure why. Anyway, but we're going to talk about these open source tools because this is basically kind of your belt and suspenders of getting your releases out there without, waiting for your CI/CD pipeline and then 40 minutes later finding out that you have an error and you're really sad. All right, so we're gonna demo all of these. Well, I'm not going to do live demos actually, but we're going to look at all of these from the perspective of, say, you're installing the stable Nginx ingress chart, and it's Lockie's opinion, and I think he's right that that's a good choice because at least at one point it was the most downloaded chart, upstream chart. So it's one that most people will at least have some familiarity with. Okay. So the first thing we're going to look at is resource validity. There's a few ways that this could not turn out well. I feel like this is such a downer of a talk because I'm just telling you everything that could go wrong. And honestly, #OpsLife, when you've spent all of your time worrying about worst case scenarios, after a while your spouse sits there and says, why are you so pessimistic? And I'm like, no, I'm just realistic. So we're going to talk about the things that can go wrong. Releases, Helm releases can fail with your resources are invalid. And that can mean a couple that's already ambiguous because that could mean you have typos or errors that are leading to invalid Kubernetes resources, or it could just mean the resources don't work on a given Kubernetes version. So let's look at examples of both of those. Say you have an invalid Kubernetes resource. And this one is, you're sitting here looking at this wall of text being like, this is really annoying because the reason why this is invalid is in here somewhere, but it's not necessarily easy to tell why. I'm guessing that we have experts in the room who can look at this and say exactly what's wrong with this. But if you're not sure what's wrong with it, you are in good company because, good Lord, you're looking at that going, what? Revy, bigger context, default spec? You're like, did she just type random things? No, this is an actual error message. It's like, sorry. And then, or your resources might not work on a specific Kubernetes version. And so this is, again, like, it's frustrating because do you really want like the giant, matrix of what will work with what? And that just ends up being frustrating. This is actually, I think, and Lockie was telling me, and I think that he's right, that we're going to probably, like, spoiler alert, prediction into the future. We're going to probably start seeing this kind of error a lot more because there's a bunch of APIs that are being deprecated as of 1.16, which is coming out, I want to say Monday. Does that sound right? Like Kubernetes 1.16 is going to be out very soon. And so if there are API endpoints that you're using, your releases might not work anymore with a new Kubernetes version. All right, so there is help for this. And Gareth Rushgrove, if you're familiar with him, he lives in Cambridge and he is wonderful. And you should definitely follow him on the Twitters and all of the other everythings. And you can install this plugin, the KubeEval plugin. If you're not familiar with this one, what it basically does is a little bit of pre-release checking to see, is this stuff even going to work? I mean, it's not going to guarantee to you that everything you want to do will work, but it will at least find some of those common errors right off the bat. So like, here's that same invalid deployment. Anybody find it to be any easier to see what's wrong with this invalid deployment? Just shout it out if you see what's wrong. Yeah. Now that all of that like alphabet soup we had before could have just said this, but it didn't. Pull request accepted. But you can use KubeEval and notice how KubeEval is just a drop-in for your install right there. So like you can use KubeEval before you try to install something to see if there's going to be any problems with it. So that's an example. Another way to look at it is to see, will this chart work with a specific version? Now this one, because 1.16 isn't out yet, so we can't show you all of the errors that would come out, but you can kind of try this. In this case, it's not broken, but you can try this and see how broken your charts will be in the future. I'm just a ray of sunshine here. It's like, and so yeah, as of 9.16, or as you would say in the reasonable parts of the world, 16.9, Monday, the Kubernetes 1.16 will be out. I don't know if it was thematically named that way or if they picked the 16th because of that. Probably not. But yeah, it pulls the API schemas like for the version and checks them. So yeah, so that's your resource validity in a nutshell. And yeah, I don't have infinite time, so we're going to skip on to policy. Everyone's favorite. Well, everyone's security people's favorite anyway. So if you would like to Kuber all the netties and have it be super exciting and not have security say no to you, then you can show them all of the great policy enforcement that it has now. And this is like the specific configuration on clusters to prevent resources from being created that shouldn't be created. You can enforce this with tools like pod security policy, gatekeeper. The Kubernetes like built-in policy stuff that you're looking at that you care about is basically open policy agent. It's the OPA stuff. And OPA can be enforced server side with pod security policy, gatekeeper, what have you. There's a number of tools. But again, that is the server will reject your not compliant stuff after you run through whatever your process is with all of the stamps of approval from, the security people and the gating and the CI/CD infrastructure and the 2 weeks with the change control review board where your YAML goes. I don't know. But these are all things that could happen. Hopefully not to you. But if it happens to your friends, tell them about ConfTest. So this, again, is from Gareth Rushgrove. He is, again, quite awesome. I kind of wish he were here. He is somewhere else. Gareth, please be at the next one of these. And there he has a blog post there that you can go read because he just introduced this summer. And this is, again, local testing. So it's using the same, Rego stuff that the open policy agent and everything else is using. But it does local testing. So again, you can see, is my chart going to fail? Hopefully before I waste a bunch of time. And if you're not familiar with Rego, by the way, I mean, you can, your Google is as good as my Google, but basically structured policy. Okay. And this is an example of ConfTest, showing what might fail if you're outside of policy. And so like, again, the policy could be our policy here is a MacGuffin. We don't really care how the policy is set. The point is we can see what the policy is before we attempt to do this release. Can somebody tell me why this particular release might fail? Exactly. So I don't know about you, but I have been told that the cloud is infinite. That might not be true. We can check on that. But it's possible that your employers care about how much your cloud bills are. And so if you have the possibility of making sure that every release is going to be scaled to, exactly what can be run inside of the infrastructure that you've provisioned, then you might prevent auto-scaling to infinity, which would, I suppose, be delightful short term for the cloud providers and way less delightful when somebody's bill comes due. So this is how you can make sure that if you set policies such that you can only launch this much without consulting someone to get the limits raised, but then you don't want your stuff to fail just because you accidentally, on purpose, exceeded that limit. Okay, and then an example of what it would look like when succeeding. This is us doing that same, the same release, or the same launch attempt with the explicitly limit set. And we can see conf test isn't going to error out if it's explicitly set. So again, this is a simple tool. It's very much in the Unix philosophy of it does one thing, it does it well, and I like that. So conf test is one to look at. And the third thing I want to talk about, RBAC, role-based access control, we're not going to talk about a third-party open source tool here. We're just going to talk about something that's built into Kubernetes for this. And this is basically a lot of what Fisher was just showing us, which is like the TLDR for RBAC. It seems very obvious, but if you don't have the permissions to do something, all right, your deployment will fail. And this is, I think, the thing that we have to pay attention to from the Helm 3 point of view. Spoiler alert, Helm 3 does not have tiller. And so if you kind of run down your dependency tree in your mind, you realize Helm 3 not having tiller means that tiller God mode, where you just kind of opened everything up and YOLO'd it, no longer works. So anything you're trying to do, if you're kind of going back in your mind and you're like, oh, right, we just kind of depended on the fact that tiller could do everything and then it was fine. Yeah, none of that's going to work anymore. So you'll have to pay a lot more attention to RBAC than you had to before, just because you can't really assume that as long as it's, in the tiller namespace, it's all good. No more tiller namespace. So you actually have to, unless, of course, you do the thing that, we don't want all your base to belong to. Unless we do that, just open everything up. People tend to object to 777 mode on everything for reasons, possibly to do with, data integrity or security or not having everything be terrifying. But, okay, so here's an example, and this is not an additional tool that you would add. This is just built into Kubernetes, is you can use kubecontrol auth cani. And Lockie whipped up this lovely for loop, which I love because it's so easy to show you, slick vendorware, marketing copy about how everything is easy. When people tell you things are easy, they are lying. They're not easy, but they are definitely comprehensible. And what we can see here, and I think it would be kind of interesting to point out, actually, this is just looking and seeing, can I create resources in any of these namespaces? And this is a user set up specifically to have some permissions and not others. And so you can see, and you can, again, this is the kind of stuff that you would build this into your CI/CD pipelines, into your automation tools. So you can see at a glance, with something that would error or not, as to whether or not, all right, this user can, in this context, in this namespace, can create deployments, roles, role bindings. Oh, can't do cluster roles. Okay. And then the ones that are showing up as not namespace scoped haven't been defined. So that's another place where, and when I was talking about this Tuesday to some other fine folks here in Amsterdam, and they were saying that, they're like, that's a terrible error. I'm like, it is kind of, isn't it? Open source. I mean, seriously, if it's a terrible error, put a pull request in to make it a better error. Because I look at that and I'm like, warning, eyes blur, fall asleep. Okay, shrug. So I don't know. I feel like somebody probably could give this a much more succinct. If we wanted to give that warning a yes or a no or a What's a 1 or 2 word summary that you would use to summarize what is going on there? Just undefined or check manual, you know. So again, like think about that when you're putting a pull request in. It's easy to criticize. It's harder to be like, oh, all right, I'm actually going to fix this. Okay, so you do, by the way, in the checking of RBAC stuff, you do have more than one option. I just went through and showed kubectl auth can I, but another good tool, you could install this with Crew, is from Aqua Security. Liz Rice and company have a pretty good tool called Who Can. And I wanted to highlight this because it's a subtle distinction. The can I is you run it as a user and you see can that user do things or not. The who can, you run that to see who can do specific things. So like depending on how you're asking the question, you might want to use a different tool. And the who can is not built into Kubernetes, but you can go get it from GitHub. So it's a good example of like there's a lot of ways to do this, but just depending on how you're trying to solve the problem. So in summary, like, all right, great. What now? I would say like it's a good idea to put these kind of pre-release checks into your CI/CD pipelines, especially because Kubernetes keeps changing, and especially with the removal of Tiller, a lot of the things that you might have been able to kind of handwave, security-wise, you can't handwave anymore. So you better start building out the infrastructure to make it possible. Those are the 3 tools that I recommend everybody at least take a look at and see if it solves any problems that they have. And then you prevent broken releases. I think the way Lockie put that when we were putting notes together to talk about this is he said, you don't have to live that broken release life anymore. And I was thinking that should be like a country and western song. But you don't have to live that broken release life anymore, or at least you can get those failure messages much faster, which is what you prefer. And then ... and profit is obviously what has to happen next after that. So I guess what I would leave us with this thought is the Vasa, this warship from the 17th century, it sank. It sank like, I don't know, a kilometer or 2 after setting forth on its initial voyage. So this was not good. And they did kind of, a little bit of, when they pulled it up off the bottom of the harbor in the 20th century, they did a bit of a postmortem to figure out what happened. And there was a lot going on in this, failed release. There was scope creep, and there was, conflicting requirements. They also had, it was very top heavy. You can see the intimidating carvings going up to the top of the ship. Many carvings were added to make the ship more intimidating. For the Swedes wanted to make the ship more intimidating to their Danish foes, which made it really top heavy, which made it, heel over and sink. But probably the biggest problem was actually the fact that the shipwright died during construction. And as was the style at the time, there was nothing written down. And so his wife and his buddy ran the shipyard and finished the boat, sort of. And it didn't go super well. And I like to think that we don't need all of our failed releases to be like the Vasa. As exciting as it is to pull a bunch of wood up from, the bottom of the seafloor hundreds of years later and find that it hasn't completely, melted away, I feel like the really useful thing is if we can get all of this stuff that we can do ad hoc that works into our CI/CD pipelines, into our configuration as code, into anything that you want to call it, but just remember that it's not just getting your specific thing working, it's taking that experience that you have from your specific thing and putting it in as an issue. Putting it in as, I feel like when people say, I don't want to contribute to open source, that sounds challenging, or that sounds difficult. And I think, honestly, some of the greatest contributions are just opening an issue on the docs repo saying, I don't understand what's happening here. And then Fisher saying, yes, I was planning on writing those docs. That's actually how we solve this, right? So I would just kind of say, here's a few links of some things to learn more about. Our team does I'm a PM on the open source upstream team at Microsoft, so I do work with the Deus Labs folks. So if you can take a look there, the Helm v3 FAQ has a lot of this, exciting, delightful changes we've been talking about. I threw container.training on there just because it's kind of fun when you go to these events to go back and have something for your coworkers to play with or do. And that's an open source project I have worked a bunch on with Jerome Patazzoni. If you're not familiar with Jerome, he used to work at a little startup called .cloud, which became Docker, and he was there for like 7 years. And now he does Kubernetes workshops. So you can check that out. I've helped him with that. And then also, because I work at Microsoft, I will point you to what is Kubernetes learning path that is actually, you can learn things from it even if you aren't using Azure. It's just kind of training. So yeah, that's what I've got. And as long as all of your questions are answered by things that I think I know, we're good. Otherwise, I have colleagues in the front row I will point you to. So thanks. Yes. Sorry, I was trying to hear that. Helm 3 using a schema? Oh, the JSON schema. I don't know anything about the JSON schema. Who can tell me things about the JSON schema? I'm handing you the mic.
So the JSON schema stuff in there is just for values validation. So it's just basically for helping out when you're trying to do like a Helm install -- set or things like that, where you're trying to validate that the user has input correct values and configuration into there, but it doesn't actually do the other part like kubeval, which is validating that the resources that you're trying to install are actually valid Kubernetes resources. So that's what the kubeval project is trying to do. The JSON schema stuff is trying to validate that when you're trying to set a value to like a string, if you have like a multiple choice answer or like a certain parameter in there, you want to validate that they say that it's a string foo, bar, or car, but you don't want them to input star and bark out on that. So 2 different use cases, but they're kind of related.
Yeah. In kubeval or with the one that
I believe it's by default. I think so, yeah. As long as the schema is there in the chart, it should be validated by default.
No. I don't think you can even disable it.
Ooh. All right. So the mats are determining that you can't actually even disable it. So you are required to have safety. All right. Do we have somebody else who has a question? I think we go to snack time now. Do we go to snack time now? Does that sound plausible, or is there another talk? Snack time. Excellent. All right. Thank you all so much.